As we all know, the Thomas & Friends wood merchandise line well, it was a complete mess. It had one of the shortest lifespans of any Thomas merchandise line in recent memory and received a major facelift after only 18 months on the market in a last-ditch attempt to save itself from failure. From fall 2017 to mid-2020, a decent amount of new toys were released, but only because the line was revamped in early 2019 with some much needed improvements. There were many duplicates of items released with minimal changes. For example, most of the engines received fully painted bodies about a year and a half after their original unpainted versions were released. There were a few exceptions. Engines like Salty, Hugo, and Steven, to name a few, never got fully painted renditions. And the exact opposite happened with characters like Ace, Nia, and Kevin. Basically, many of the engines and sets that were supposed to be released in 2018 were delayed until their painted counterparts were ready. This sudden shift in branding created numerous instances where planned items were not released on time, if at all. By 2019, it felt like the wood line had righted itself. All of the main characters had received updated cosmetics, and the new engines and sets pertaining to Big World Big Adventures were finally making their way to store shelves. But there was one set in particular that was stuck in limbo and never recovered. It was called the Castle Tower set, and for a moment it looks like a normal Thomas Wood release. However, it only appeared in Canada and never made its way to the United States. Now you may be asking, why is this a big deal? It's not unusual for items from merchandise ranges to never reach particular countries. It's the way the world works, and the people in charge of distributing the toys have their reasons. But if we're being honest, the US tends to be the center of most modern Thomas merch. That is, stuff definitely gets released here, and then like 80 to 90% of it makes its way to other countries with strong Thomas followings. For a planned domestic release to not go through in the United States is a big deal. That means you know something has gone very wrong. And as mentioned earlier, the entire Thomas Wood lifespan was a hot mess, so it's really not surprising that this happened to at least one item. But I find the demise of the Castle Tower set to be particularly interesting because I witnessed its near release in person, and it always stuck with me how close this item was to falling into place. So let's jump back to the summer of 2019, and what a summer that was. I spent nearly a month on the East Coast of the United States driving around and meeting with a bunch of my friends. It all started in mid-July when we held our annual ThomasWoodenRailway meetup in Pennsylvania. That went along for about a week or so, and then I visited Strasburg, a few cool train stores, got to see some of the original Thomas props from the TV show. It was a really fun time. Part of my journey also took me north of the border, and I visited the Canadian province of Ontario for a few days when I stayed with my buddy Oliver Duck, aka Ted. On the way back to the United States, I made an effort to stop at Toys R Us, and this was a big deal. The year prior, Toys R Us had shut its doors in the US, and there was really no great place to buy Thomas merchandise in person anymore besides going to Walmart or Target. However, Toys R Us is owned by a different company outside of the United States, and as of the making of this video, they are still around in other countries. Anyway, I decided to stop at a few Toys R Us locations on my way back to the border because, well, it's Toys R Us, and I, along with a lot of other people, have so many great memories from our childhoods connected to the big TRU. I didn't think the merchandise was going to be anything spectacular. It was probably going to mimic what was available on Amazon at the time. As a reminder, fully painted Thomas Wood items had been released a few months prior, Adventures was in the process of being replaced by Push Along, and Trackmaster/Motorized was still around. All Engines Go was well over a year away from being formally announced. As an American, it was cool to look at some of the different items that were on the shelves and, of course, the different pricing. I remember picking up this Thomas and the Chinese Dragon 2-pack because it had not yet released in the US. And since I knew the Wood line was on shaky ground, I thought about buying it in case, for some reason, it never made its way to America. However, there was another item on the shelf that caught my eye right away, but it wasn't until months and years later that I realized its significance. You guessed it, it was that pesky Castle Tower set. Initially, I thought it was a cool item because it had not yet been released in the United States, and I took this picture for sorta record-keeping purposes. However, it never once crossed my mind to purchase the set. Although I was driving around on the East Coast, I had flown into an airport in Ohio to begin my summer road trip and was scheduled to fly back. And while I did buy a ton of Thomas Wooden Railway items during my extended vacation, I definitely did not have the room to fit this set in my suitcase for the plane ride home. So I took a few pictures and left and didn't think much about that set because I was assuming it was only a matter of time before we saw it in a Target or a Barnes & Noble in the United States. Well, turns out that never happened. The Thomas Wood line was all but discontinued the following year. In early 2020, I took this picture at a Target in Florida where every single Thomas Wood item was on clearance. The line wasn't dead at this point, but it was not a good sign that Target was ridding itself of toys that had only been around for a year. We got a few more sporadic Wood releases in 2020, including Edward, Henry, Toby, and Etienne, but that was it. There was a 2021 Day Out with Thomas item released the following year, but the line was clearly on its deathbed prior to that. We never received official word from Fisher-Price about the line's cancellation, but when the new Thomas Wooden Railway Thomas was leaked on Amazon in August 2021, that was basically our confirmation that Wood was over. All this time, though, in the back of my mind, I was still curious about the numerous Thomas Wood items that were scheduled to be released but had seemingly been canceled by Mattel, likely due to the lack of sales with the existing items on the shelves. However, I still couldn't shake that Castle Tower set. I mean, I had seen it in person in Canada, and it had never appeared at a Barnes & Noble in the US or been available to purchase on Amazon. If I hadn't had photographic evidence, the entire experience would have felt like a fever dream. It wasn't until recently that I finally saw the set used and for sale for the first time. These are pictures from a Canadian Facebook Marketplace listing from January 2024, and someone is selling most of the items that came in the original set. I don't know how many of these Castle Tower sets were sold, but I'm guessing there weren't many of them as this is the first time I've seen the set for sale as an American. If I had to guess, and I mean this is a total guess, maybe 50 of these sets were sold across the entirety of Canada. Again, it's just a guess, but they are seemingly non-existent. We know that Wood was not a popular merchandise line, and this set wasn't cheap. So it would have taken a dedicated parent to shell out this kind of money on a lackluster merchandise range. I will admit, I think this set is super cool because it kind of released, but not really. You could argue and say it's a Canadian exclusive, but we all know this set was supposed to make its way to the US and potentially the rest of the world. However, the inside turmoil at Fisher-Price and Mattel was too much to overcome. The layout is nothing special, it's your average Thomas Wood set, but I was always intrigued by potentially having a wooden figure of Sir Robert Norrenby for the first time, even if he is in this form. So while there were plenty of Thomas Wood items that were scheduled to be released in the latter half of 2019 and beyond that never made their way to stores, the Castle Tower set falls into this weird area of technically being released, but also not really. That's why I think it's one of the more interesting Thomas Wood items that we ever got from that brief merchandise range. Let me know what you think of the Castle Tower set in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.